Welcome to today's IMAR seminar. I'm Felicity Okoth, the IMAR Bargain Coordinator and a PhD at the University of Bergen. I will be shortly introducing today's speaker, Regine Paul, shortly. But before I do this, I would like to thank you for signing up and setting aside time to join us. It's the first seminar we've organized this year, and we hope it will set the tone for the forthcoming seminars. Going by the interest this has drawn from across board, joining us are migration scholars, researchers, and PhDs embedded in different institutions in Bergen, Oslo, Denmark, and as far as Spain. We also have individuals working in various migration-related industries like UDI and IOM, which is very interesting. We'd earlier announced that this will be a hybrid seminars, but circumstances necessitated otherwise. We do apologize for the inconvenience caused to those who had registered to attend in person and really hope that you have joined us online. That said, our seminar today is based on the Handbook on the Governance and Politics of Migration, published in 2021 and co-edited by Regine Paul. The handbook sets out different frameworks for the critical appraisal of migration governance. And in her talk, Regine Paul specifically focused on the handbook's conceptual analytical framework, or rather conceptual analytical map, and in so doing, summarize the book's key contributions to the repoliticization and decolonization of migration governance research. Regine Paul is an associate professor in political science at the Department of Administration and Organizational Theory at the University of Bergen. She has published widely on comparative labor migration and mobility governance in Europe, and on the notions of risk and resilience in policymaking at large, of course. Her current research addresses the uses and regulations of artificial intelligence technologies in the public sector, and she's also the editor of the Critical Policy Studies, a journal in her field. Before we start, I'd love to highlight some housekeeping rules. So Regine Paul will present her work, and then afterwards we'll open the floor for a Q&A session. So to be able to manage the time, we would please kindly ask you to type any questions or comments you might have on the chat box, and I'll read this out to Regine Paul. And please do indicate your name and affiliation before or after posting your questions, and we shall be able to hopefully engage and keep the discussions within the time frame slated for this particular seminar. Regine will stay on for a while after the official seminar part and have a virtual coffee with everyone who wishes to carry on with the discussion. And so if you have any other additional pressing questions, you could always stay behind. So Regine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Tusen takk, Felicity, also to Kari and Tur and Imar for bringing this on. This is a great pleasure to talk and to be able to connect with Imar and researchers, migration researchers at the University of Bergen and beyond on the occasion of presenting this handbook and some of the ideas that me and my co-editors, you see Emma Carmel and Katharina Lenner here as well, had when designing it. So we started out in 2016 to produce that handbook. And yes, it took 5 years, but our excuse is that two of us at least had 3 children between us since. I want to say upfront that even though sometimes relentless, this process of designing an outline for a large volume such as this, inviting our favorite authors along, or some of our favorite authors, trying to include a diversity of authors from different regions in the world, teasing out their critical voices as editors, and also reflecting back upon our own research and writing was really enjoyable. So it took a long time, but I think we all learned a lot. I'm kind of up for doing it again, actually. The handbook's aim was to critically examine the state of the art on governance and politics of migration in an interdisciplinary perspective. So we didn't limit ourselves to political science. We included sociology, critical legal studies, human geography, anthropology, and also political economy. And we asked authors to provide accessible reviews on scholarly approaches to key themes such as citizenship, borders, nation states, development, detention, forced versus voluntary migration, etc., but to equally expose where state-of-the-art accounts, in the view of our authors, displace or obscure the political struggles and choices which underpin migration governance. So our goal was really to politicize all the choices that go into how migration is governed, to repoliticize how it's being understood, but also resisted. We gathered 33 chapters and written an introduction, and this is what I'll present today, mainly the introduction, which sets out the conceptual analytical framework for the rest of the book. And we really tried to use that as a conceptual hub you know, in interactions with our authors, try to create that as a baseline for their writing as well. Now I'm working with two screens. I need to change the screen here. Actually, before diving into this conceptual approach, I wanted to start with a little episode, actually, from my own home country, from Germany, which in May 2020 took a decision in the middle of the pandemic to charter flights for Romanian and Bulgarian workers to pick asparagus. 80,000 of those were brought in May 2020. And with that, the government lifted the then very strict mobility restrictions. It was literally impossible for anyone entering the country at the time. So in the middle of the corona pandemic, and they did that with a triple win argument. German producers of asparagus would save the highly valuable harvest and avoid bankruptcy, basically. German consumers would be able to eat one of their favorite late spring dishes, and Eastern European workers would keep access to comparatively well-paid jobs. Now, it is in moments of crisis, and the pandemic is a crisis, arguably, that governance choices become visible as political. So indeed, I think that this episode of asparagus picking in the middle of a pandemic, state-granted mobility in the middle of a global halt on mobility, visibilizes the complex, often incongruent, political decisions that are being made in migration governance, every day, all across the world. So to me, this little episode, and there are others, highlights how governments enact concepts of utility to enable human mobility at particular times, even when it is otherwise restricted. It highlights how local governance practices, here specific employers in the asparagus sector, interact with global socioeconomic structures. These include wage discrepancies, value chains, division of labor, but also other things that we could think of. And to me, the episode also highlights contradictions and incongruencies between the treatment of mobile Bulgarian and Romanians, while many of them count as unwanted poverty migrants in German cities, and their social rights have been curtailed, even though they're EU citizens. Their helping hands as asparagus pickers are welcomed, even in the pandemic. And that is typical, of course, of policymaking more generally, but our handbook is trying to tease out, or the contributions in the handbook try to tease out these kind of incongruencies in governance and what they actually mean in practice. These are some of the recurring themes of our handbook, and I want to lay them out in a bit more detail in the remainder of my talk. In the introduction to the handbook, we're proposing three conceptual elements of a framework. So 3 conceptual propositions for understanding migration governance. And I want to go through all 3 of them with you now. The first one is that we think of migration and its governance as co-produced in mutually constitutive ways. So that means that on the one hand side, the practice and experience of migration is shaped by efforts to govern it. So by efforts of public authorities and other actors to control it, to channel it, to steer it. And we know, of course, from different literatures in sociology and political science, that such control efforts are never straightforward. They never work in the intended ways, but they are nonetheless consequential. They do have effects on the ways in which migration happens and migrants lead their lives. Now, in the handbook, for example, we have chapters on humanitarianism, the global refugee regime, or the governance of trafficking, which highlight how the legal codification of what humanitarian protection is, who counts as a victim, how that affects people's lives. So we have that relationship between governance and the experience of migration. But we also have the vice versa relationship of the practice of governing being shaped by actual migration patterns and by how public authorities perceive them. And I think my asparagus picking episode offers a nice little illustration of that, how changed empirical mobility patterns, in this case themselves due to a governance decision, right, to halt mobility, how they can clash with dominant economic models, with dominant problem perceptions, in this case, a lack of seasonal workers, to pick asparagus, and how that can then fuel policy measures again. Now, to us, such observations mean that we cannot really treat migration and its governance as objective, as neutral, but really that we need to explore how migration as an empirical phenomenon interacts with policy relevant perceptions of it and control attempts. So this is really what we're trying to bring out under this first notion of migration and governance as co-constitutive of one another. The second proposition is that migration governance must be understood as regimes of governance practices, and that really draws on Emma Kalmer's work on governance analytics that she published in 2019. And the idea here is really that we need to take both a multi-level, but also a multi-scalar perspective on migration governance. And I know that I'm talking to at least some critical geographers and anthropologists today, so they will hopefully appreciate that view on multi-scalar governance in addition to multi-level. So multi-level on the first hand really means that migration governance needs to be understood as produced or made in highly structured relationships of power and authority, which span from the global migration regime at the UN level, involve regional actors such as the EU or NAFTA or others, involves national governments, but also local governments, and of course also societal actors at all these levels. And a good example of such multi-level governance is the way in which the UN Global Compact on migration has been negotiated and is being implemented. But we think that, on the other hand, to fully grasp the effects of and responses to migration governance, we also need to understand how they are enacted in particular places and spaces on the ground. It is in these specific places, think of workplaces, cities, rural areas, camps, detention centers, etc., that the various governance efforts are being, they kind of come together, they are being enacted and felt. It is there that, the liminality, a very prominent concept, the incongruencies and tensions between different regulatory conditions hit, if you will, and need to be made to work in actual people's lives, right? And we have a chapter on workplaces, for instance. We have a couple of chapters on specific spaces, but a chapter on workplaces by a legal scholar, Tesseltje de Lange, and co-authors, who show that how labor admission rules and employment rights kind of often clash and are in tension with another and are then being negotiated by migrant workers on the ground with their respective employers, be it ship masters, migrant recruitment agencies, or the madame in a domestic worker's home. So these rights and rules are being negotiated on the ground, and it matters because it might change the livelihoods of migrants and which rules are actually bended or resisted. So for us, in the second notion of governance as regimes of governance practices, really highlights the coexistence and interaction of multiple, at times contradictory and nested universes of migration governance, both across the world, across levels of governance, but also in any one place, right? These contradictions are relevant in any one place we look at. Our third proposition is that politics does not just reside in formal institutions, such as government departments, courts, or international organizations. Of course, these matter a lot, mainly because they have large formal, what Bourdieu would call symbolic capital. So they have a formalized power to create categories of thought by turning them into law, basically, and to enact them. But from a constructivist viewpoint, of course, the focus on formal institutions requires expansion. And I want to highlight three ways in which this matters in the handbook. The first is that we need to have a focus on ideational power as well as more classic understandings of power related to resources, for instance. And that connects to the work of scholars such as Vivian Schmidt, but also others. I mentioned Bourdieu before. A lot of the chapters in the handbook focus on this ideational dimension of having the power to create categories of thought, basically, and enacting them in policymaking. Secondly, we need to situate such ideational power in migrant or migration regulation in the structural context of global inequalities, colonial produced hierarchies of knowledge, etc. So they don't operate in a vacuum. I mean, Bourdieu, I think, said once that not anyone can say anything, but only some people's, visions of the world matter. And that is exactly what we're trying to do here too, situating this knowledge creation and the creation of policy categories in global power relations, basically. And thirdly, we also think that we should include in our analysis of politics the often more informal, gradual, everyday life contestation of rulemaking, institutional authority, and the use of force and violence. And some of our authors do that, especially those who take a more sociological or ethnographic approach to migration governance. Now, these three conceptual propositions then shape our analytical approach to the governance and politics of migration, because we suggest to view migration governance through three what we call constitutive contradictions. So this is really just a way in which what I said before can be mobilized in writing about migration or in researching migration. And the chapters in the book, I mean, none of them address all three maybe, but the chapters in the book seek to make these explicit, these contradictions, as a foundational for the dynamics and effects of migration governance across the globe. The first is that we think of migration governance as conceptually framed through notions. Think of these labels, notions of citizens, nation states, security, border, what do all these mean, basically. But the ways in which these concepts are imprinted into policies and governing always has material effects. And this is important for us to highlight. This is not just a deconstruction of migration governance that operates in the ideational world, but we also need to address the actual material effects of these ideational practices, basically. And we address these relationships head on in the handbook, and our authors do, in section 1, where our authors review some of the core concepts and the socio-political history of these concepts, such as citizenship or development, etc. There's also section 2, where we address specific categories of migration and how they have been thought of, how the development, how thinking about them has developed over time, and what effects specific categories of migration have when they are turned into legal categories and are attached to rights, etc. So this concerns categories such as forced versus voluntary migrants, highly skilled versus low skilled migrants, victims of human trafficking, family members, a very contested notion because it's until present day not very clear whether, for example, gay marriages count as family members, and they don't in all countries of the world, as you can imagine. So these categories are a way of politicizing and repoliticizing how we think about migration and migrants' rights. So here the takeaway message is really that our conceptual ideas about migration and governments or governance actors' ideas about migration matter because they become enacted in policymaking. They determine what rights people have. The second point we want to make here, or the second contradiction, if you wish, is that governance and politics of migration is at the same time global. It's always inherently global, and it's relational. To us, this means researching the ways in which expressions of migration governance in specific places and settings, I mentioned workplaces before, are both particular to that case, but also always interconnected with the more global trends and patterns of migration, and the structural conditions that support specific governance regimes, really. They are also connected through time, and that's a very important point for the decolonial project in the social science. As Lucy Mablin says in her opening chapter for the handbook, where she writes about colonialism and decolonialism, the present is never new. And this is very important for migration governance because we think that it cannot be detached from contemporary implications of the colonial past. I mean, Lucy Mablin talks about the colonial present. And importantly, this implies leaving behind, or at least relaxing, Euro or Western-centric analysis of migration governance. And what we call methodological nationalism. So, and I'm guilty of that myself. My own research in migration governance has been very Eurocentric to the extent that I looked at labor migration regimes in Europe. But to relax that Eurocentrism to us would mean to involve the ways in which, say, the French labor migration regime relates to its colonial past explicitly or in hidden ways, right? And that's very important, and we a lot of our chapters bring that out in the analysis. We have a chapter on migrants' role in the global value chain, for instance, by Shamel Asmeh, who argues that researchers need to stop treating migrant workers' presence in specific production locations as unique to that place. Instead, we really need to explore the relationships of migrant worker governance in that particular workplace within the globalized and highly segmented production patterns in labor markets. So in a way, this is kind of reiterating the globalism agenda, right? That we need to draw out both the global relations between places, but also the particularities of governance in one place. Last not least, migration governance and politics must also be analyzed as both at the same time highly structured and dynamic. That is a seeming contradiction, but it draws on the more kind of critical evolutionist work of people such as Bob Jessop and Guy Ling Sum, who suggest that, you know, the structural conditions, power relations, and dominant conceptualizations that shape governance in general might be relatively structured and stable, but they're never completely fixated. And they draw on Gramsci, among others, in their work, and some of our authors do as well. But the important point to highlight here is that governance regimes, as it were, remain unfinished, open to interpretation and reconstruction, and hence with also open to contestation. We have section 5 and 6 in particular, which address particular dimensions of mobilization against dominant forms of governance in the migration realm. And that involves political activism of migrant groups themselves. It involves legal mobilizations by so-called migrant advocates in the legal realm. It involves trade unionist economic mobilization around the notion of decent work, but it also involves, of course, anti-immigrant and nativist movements who contest, for instance, the notion of liberal migration governance. In any case, for us, such contestation usually involves the unpacking of the taken for granted nature of some of the concept. So kind of attacking the more structured ways in which governance is done. So to summarize this, really, politics in our perspective then addresses both the ways in which political choices and judgment calls in migration governance are being invisibilized. This is what I talked about earlier when I said some of these political choices only become visible in moments of crisis, but also the ways in which they are openly contested and repoliticized. We can talk more about these contradictions in the Q&A, but I wanted to just briefly show you the structure of the handbook for those of you who haven't seen it yet. And it should become clear, hopefully, from what I said earlier, what the different parts contribute here. So we have section 1 that really talks about key concepts in migration governance and tries to display the socio-political but also epistemological history of these concepts, you know, be it citizenship, the notion of a border, the notion of a nation state, etc. We then talk about, in part 2, about specific categories of migration, such as forced or voluntary migrants, skilled or high-skilled worker, etc. We also have a dedicated section in part 3 where we talk about, or our authors talk about, key institutions and regimes of migration governance, including the global refugee regime, for instance, and they try to unpack how they evolved, what rationalities they were founded on, how these changed over time, perhaps, and how they are also contested. We have a specific part in part 4 on spaces of migration governance, such as workplaces, homes, camps, detention centers, where we really try to spatialize migrants' experiences in being governed in specific ways, but also contestation of these governance regimes. There is part 5 where we talk about specific processes and practices of migration governance. For instance, the processes surrounding detention, the role of time in migration governance, which I know is also a big focus here at EMER. And that really tries to draw out the politics of some of these processes of managing migration. And the last one is specifically dedicated to areas of contestation, including, as I said, legal activism or political activism. I want to finish by highlighting some of the key contributions that go beyond our own introduction or any one chapter. We suggest that there are 3 contributions for migration research in the future, and they all start from our strong epistemological conviction that migration governance research is itself actually an expression of governance and politics. So this is also about the politics of producing knowledge in this field. Now, firstly, the handbook asks the migration research community to stay attentive and critical towards the concepts and categories we use to describe and analyze phenomena. We require deep understanding of the social, economic, and political history of these concepts, the categories, and we also need to understand the global inequalities on which they build and which they often reproduce. Think of the notion of a nation state, which is a very Western notion, and which kind of in not so nice ways also relates to the attempt to detach empires from their former colonies. Secondly, in that same context, we want to highlight the politics of knowledge production in migration governance research, actually, that is often associated with ideas about specific disciplines and what they could contribute. So policymaking is often influenced by economic and demographic analysis of migration. And they often don't really unpack the concepts that we use to talk about migration. So this is also a call to have a wider interdisciplinary debate about the very concepts we use also in policymaking. There's also often a silozation in migration governance research that we think needs to be overcome, at least partially. So often the research field follows these politically inaugurated categories. There is research on forced migration, there's research on so-called voluntary migration, for example, there's research on labor migration, there's research on asylum. And by doing that, by siloing research in that way, I think we lack the opportunity to critically analyze how these labels come about and what they actually do on the ground. So we need to talk a bit more across these silos. And a lot of researchers started that, and we want to promote that quest even further. And last not least, this also relates to the question of who produces authoritative knowledge on migration governance, both in academia and the policy world. And that is closely related to the decolonial project in the social science. So whose knowledge counts in migration governance? Why, and how could a more pluralist epistemology change contemporary migration governance and its scholarly scrutiny? Why does research often, at least, mainly talk about south to north migration rather than south to south migration, or actually north to south migration? That is then usually coined in the terms of expats rather than migration. So the large focus on south to north migration in Western scholarly efforts, we think, misrecognizes dynamics of migration, empirical dynamics of migration and its governance. And as I said before, I include my own work here sometimes, I'm critical of my own work from that perspective. It also misses a chance to enrich dominant scholarly concepts and methods for researching migration governance, and to situate our understanding of migration in the colonial history of migration, but also of knowledge generation. And I want to end really with a note from the recent work by Gominda Bambra, who highlights that the continuing dominant myth in the global north of migration as a contained problem for northern nation states really misrecognizes, deeply misunderstands the history of colonialism, the nature of imperial rather than nation states, whose wealth creation was founded on the colonial extraction of labor and resources, and the lasting effects of this colonialism even after attempts of detachment for the populations formerly exploited and ruled, who are not by coincidence the now problematic migrants in many cases that need to be secured against. So tackling the colonial present head-on, as many of our chapters try to do that, enables us to explore racialized concepts of the good and bad migrant, and their intersection also with other markers of difference. It allows us to explain why the Romanian asparagus pickers count as valuable and worthy of mobility, even in a pandemic, whilst the Roma fellows actually in European cities, despite their European citizenship, count as unwanted poverty migrants. So there is a lot of work to do, and I want to end here and look forward to your questions.